The vast silence of space wrapped the research vessel Acheron like a shroud. Out here in the cold, empty reaches of the Zeta Orionis system, even the distant stars seemed like dying embers, flickering dimly against the eternal night. No radio signals, no distant cosmic noise, just an endless, oppressive silence that pressed down on the crew like a suffocating weight. Dr. Eleanor Graves stood at the observation deck, staring into that void, her hands clasped behind her back. Her dark eyes, sharp and calculating, reflected the faint glow of the ship's control panels. To her, the emptiness was comforting, the silence a welcome reprieve from the chaos of life back on Earth. But tonight, something felt wrong. The darkness outside the ship seemed to ripple, as though something unseen moved beneath its surface, waiting. "We're almost there," came a voice from behind her. It was Jonathan Hale, the ship's engineer, his voice a quiet murmur. "The signal's getting stronger." Eleanor didn't turn. "Good. Let me know when we're in range to land." Jonathan hesitated, then added, "The others, they've been having strange dreams. Nightmares, actually. They're not saying much, but—" "They're just tired," Eleanor interrupted, her tone dismissive. "It's been a long journey. Once we've landed and started collecting data, their minds will focus." He didn't respond, only nodded. Everyone knew Eleanor wasn't the kind to entertain idle worries. She was a driven woman, focused solely on the mission. She'd led the team through uncharted space, chasing the strange, elusive signal for months. There had been no other leads, no other signs of life, just this haunting, irregular pulse that called to her in a way she couldn't explain. Jonathan left her alone in the observation deck, his footsteps fading into the low hum of the ship's systems. Eleanor continued to stare into the abyss, her thoughts consumed by the signal that had drawn them all this way. The dreams he'd mentioned. She had experienced them too. Shadowy figures, their faces blurred, standing on a blood-red horizon. They whispered things she couldn't understand, their voices distant but insistent, pulling her deeper into the dark corners of her mind. She shook it off, focusing instead on the mission. They were close now, so close. 55-6-16. An uncharted, forgotten world, buried deep in the heart of a starless region of space. There had been no record of life, no mention of any civilization. It was as though the planet didn't exist until the signal had started. A rhythmic, almost organic pulse that had been so faint at first, only Eleanor had noticed it. But now it was undeniable. It grew stronger the closer they got, vibrating through the very hull of the ship as though it were a heartbeat. The rest of the crew gathered in the central command room as the ship descended toward the planet. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Jonathan manned the controls, while Mira Delaney, the xenobiologist, sat at her station, nervously tapping her fingers on the console. Beside her was Dr. Liam Carter, the team's psychologist, who had grown increasingly uneasy since they had entered the Zeta Orionis system. His normally calm demeanor had been replaced by an edge of paranoia. Even Etta Kolvik, the geologist who had been excited about the possibility of unearthing unknown minerals, had grown quiet, her eyes constantly darting to the flickering monitors. As the planet appeared on the main screen, the crew fell silent. It was a desolate, forbidding place, a barren landscape of jagged rocks and craters. The atmosphere was thin, barely habitable, and the surface reflected no light. The planet was bathed in an unnatural darkness, its features obscured by the eerie red glow of the ship's landing lights. "There's nothing here," Jonathan whispered, but Eleanor knew better. The signal pulsed louder now, its rhythm steady, pulling them forward. "Set us down near those ruins," she ordered, pointing to a distant structure barely visible through the haze. The landing was rough, the ground beneath them unstable, as if the planet itself resisted their presence. The Acheron shuddered as it touched down, a low groan reverberating through the hull. Once the engines powered down, the silence returned. It was heavier now, thick with the weight of something unseen, something waiting just beyond the edge of perception. The crew suited up, their movements mechanical, the unease settling over them like a second skin. No one spoke, but they all felt it. The sensation of being watched, of something ancient stirring beneath the surface of this forgotten world. The ruins loomed ahead of them as they stepped onto the planet's surface. The structure was enormous, its architecture alien yet strangely familiar, as though it had been built by hands that knew both the stars and the earth. The walls were made of an unidentifiable stone, smooth and cold to the touch, with strange symbols etched into them, symbols that pulsed faintly with a dim, internal light. "What do you think this place is?" Mira's voice cracked through the radio. "An outpost, maybe," Edda suggested, her voice strained. "Or a tomb." Eleanor ran her gloved fingers over the markings on the wall, her mind racing. These symbols were unlike anything they had seen before. They seemed to pulse in time with the signal, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing. "Let's head inside," Eleanor ordered. They entered the structure, the dark corridors winding deep into the earth. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and an unplaceable acrid scent. The walls closed in around them, the light from their helmets casting long shadows that flickered and danced as though alive. The signal grew louder as they descended, the pulsing rhythm resonating through their bones. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened, matching the strange frequency. Something was down here, something waiting, something ancient. In the lowest chamber, they found it, a vast hall filled with towering sarcophagi. Each was adorned with the same alien symbols, their surfaces cold and smooth. At the center of the room, a massive obelisk stood, its surface covered in inscriptions, radiating a faint, ominous glow. Jonathan's voice trembled as he whispered, "We shouldn't be here." But Eleanor was mesmerized, drawn to the obelisk, her hands reaching out to touch its surface. The instant her fingers brushed against it, a low hum filled the chamber. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as if the room itself was alive, reacting to their presence. The signal was no longer a distant call. It was here. It had always been here, buried beneath the surface, waiting for them, waiting for someone to listen. The stale air inside the underground chamber felt heavier with each step they took. The cold stone beneath their boots reverberated with an unsettling hum, as if the entire planet was alive, its heart buried somewhere deep beneath the surface. The alien obelisk towered above them, its inscriptions faintly glowing in the dim light of their headlamps, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like living creatures. Eleanor Graves stood before the obelisk, transfixed. Her fingers traced the ancient symbols, their meanings just out of reach, as if they were alive and whispering secrets her mind couldn't quite grasp. She could feel it now, more than ever before. The pulse of the signal, the very rhythm of the universe, vibrating through her bones. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. Something was watching, something ancient, something patient. Behind her, the rest of the crew moved cautiously through the chamber. Jonathan Hale's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously to the towering sarcophagi that lined the walls. Each one was massive, towering above them, and sealed shut with what looked like thick, translucent stone. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside those tombs wasn't meant to be disturbed. "Dr. Graves," Jonathan whispered, his voice barely cutting through the oppressive silence. "We should leave. There's something wrong with this place. I don't think we were meant to find it." But Eleanor didn't turn. Her fingers danced across the surface of the obelisk, tracing the symbols that seemed to move beneath her touch, like ripples in water. She didn't acknowledge the unease creeping up the back of her mind, the chill in the air that no suit could keep out. "We're too close, Jonathan," she murmured, her voice distant, entranced. "This is what we came for. We're on the edge of discovery. Don't you feel it? This isn't just an archaeological site. It's something more, something alive." Mira Delaney, the xenobiologist, stepped forward cautiously, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. "These sarcophagi, they're not made of stone. This material, it's almost organic." Her gloved hand hovered over the surface of one of the tombs, where the translucent casing seemed to pulse faintly, like something was moving inside. "This isn't just a burial ground." She turned to Eleanor, her voice wavering. "They're not dead. Whatever's inside these, they're still alive." Liam Carter, the team psychologist, backed away from the nearest sarcophagus, his breathing growing shallow. "We need to go. Now, these aren't just relics of some ancient civilization. This place, it's a prison, and we're trespassing." Eleanor finally turned, her face bathed in the soft glow of the obelisk's light. There was a look in her eyes, something more than just curiosity. Obsession, the need to understand, to know. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We can't leave, not yet." The moment she spoke those words, the chamber seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows themselves were pressing in. The air became colder, and the strange pulsing hum intensified. The signal, once distant, almost like a heartbeat, now throbbed in their ears, reverberating through their bodies. Jonathan took a step back, his eyes locked on the nearest sarcophagus. "Something's happening. The lids. Look." The translucent material of the sarcophagi began to tremble, faint cracks appearing across the surface. From within, there was movement, slow, deliberate, like something waking from a long, dreamless sleep. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "It's them," she whispered. "They're alive." A deafening crack split the air. One of the sarcophagi exploded outward, shards of the strange material flying across the chamber. The crew ducked instinctively, their suits absorbing the impact, but when they looked up, what they saw chilled them to their cores. The creature that emerged was tall, impossibly gaunt, its skin a sickly translucent gray that shimmered faintly under the dim light. Its elongated limbs moved with an unnatural grace, each movement smooth yet predatory. Its face, if it could be called that, was a twisted mockery of humanoid features, with hollow, sunken eyes that glowed a deep, malevolent crimson. It turned its head toward the crew, its movements impossibly fast, its glowing eyes locking onto each of them in turn. Liam took a step back, his voice shaking. "Oh God, it's not human. It's never been human." The creature's eyes fixed on him, and in the blink of an eye, it moved. One moment, it stood across the chamber. The next, it was upon him. It moved like liquid, a blur of motion that defied all natural laws. Before Liam could even scream, its long skeletal fingers wrapped around his throat. The next sound was a sickening, wet snap. Liam's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The creature crouched over him, its eyes glowing with an insatiable hunger. It bent down, its mouth opening far wider than it should have, and began to feed, not on his flesh, but on something deeper, something vital. As it fed, Liam's body shriveled, his skin tightening, his form collapsing into a lifeless husk. Jonathan stumbled backward, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to get out of here, now!" But the others, Eleanor, Mira, Edda, were frozen in place, their eyes locked on the creature. And then, all at once, the other sarcophagi began to crack, the same ominous hum filling the air. One by one they shattered, and more of the creatures emerged from their long slumber, each one moving with the same terrifying speed and grace. Edda screamed, bolting for the exit, but one of the creatures was faster. It leaped across the chamber in a single, fluid motion, intercepting her before she reached the door. Its claws ripped through her suit as if it were tissue paper, and before anyone could react, it drained her just as it had drained Liam, her body collapsing into nothing more than dust and bones. Mira, wide-eyed with terror, turned to Eleanor, her voice shaking. "We're all going to die here. We need to—" But Eleanor wasn't listening. She stood transfixed, her gaze locked on the creatures. Even as her crew was slaughtered around her, she couldn't look away. She felt a strange connection to them, as if they were calling to her, beckoning her deeper into the mystery that surrounded this place. One of the creatures, larger than the others, approached Eleanor, its crimson eyes glowing brighter, its thin lips curling into what might have been a smile. It didn't attack her, didn't lunge like it had with the others. It merely stood before her, its cold, dead gaze locked with hers. Liam, trembling, reached for Eleanor, trying to pull her away. "Eleanor, please, we have to go. They're killing us." But Eleanor only shook her head, her voice soft, almost reverent. "They're not killing us. They're feeding." The creature tilted its head, as if understanding her. Then, without another moment's hesitation, it turned away, joining the others as they finished their grisly feast. Eleanor watched in silence as the creatures moved through the chamber, their hunger temporarily sated. They didn't attack her. They didn't even seem to notice her anymore. To them, she wasn't prey. She was something else entirely. Something useful. The surface of LV-616 had changed. The moment they emerged from the subterranean crypt, the sky above had shifted from a pale, starless void into something far more sinister. A deep crimson hue blanketed the horizon, casting everything in an eerie, blood-red light. The thin atmosphere, once merely oppressive, now felt malevolent, as if the planet itself had awakened along with the creatures that had been entombed for eons. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, constant hum that vibrated through their bones, a reminder of what still lurked beneath their feet. Eleanor Graves staggered out of the ancient ruin, her mind still reeling from the horrors she had witnessed below. Behind her, Jonathan Hale and Mira Delaney followed, their movements sluggish, their expressions hollow. The terror that had overwhelmed them in the tomb had not dissipated upon reaching the surface. Instead, it clung to them, crawling under their skin, infecting their thoughts. The planet, once a distant curiosity, now felt alive in a way that defied understanding. A predator, a sentient presence watching them from the skies, waiting for them to fall apart. Jonathan leaned heavily against a jagged outcrop of stone, clutching at his chest. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and his face was pale, almost ashen. "We need to get to the ship," he rasped, his voice tight with pain. "We have to..." Get out of here. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts were scattered, her mind still reeling from the moment in the tomb when the alien creature had stood before her, studying her with its cold, crimson eyes. She had been spared. The others, Liam, Edda, had not been so lucky. The creatures had drained them, consumed them as though they were nothing more than cattle. But Eleanor had been left untouched. Why? As Jonathan continued to wheeze and cough, Eleanor shook herself from the haze of her thoughts and turned to him. His hand was trembling as he pulled it away from his chest, revealing a dark stain spreading across the fabric of his suit. Blood. "No," she whispered, stepping toward him, her heart pounding. "Jonathan, how?" Jonathan's face twisted in pain as he collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing. "One of them, back in the crypt, it bit me." Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering uselessly over his shaking form. The bite mark on his neck was deep, the skin around it blackened and swollen, pulsing with a sickly, unnatural energy. She felt a sinking dread in her stomach as she realized the truth. The bite wasn't just a wound, it was something more. A curse. Mira knelt beside him as well, her face pale with fear. She reached out to touch Jonathan's arm, but he jerked away, his eyes wild with panic. Don't touch me," he gasped. "I can feel it inside me. It's changing me." A sickening crack echoed from his bones as his body convulsed again, more violently this time. His skin, once a healthy shade of tan, had begun to turn a ghastly shade of gray, the veins beneath the surface darkening, twisting, like roots spreading through his flesh. His eyes, bloodshot and wide with terror, began to glow faintly, the same crimson hue that had burned in the eyes of the creatures below. "No," Mira breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, this isn't happening." Eleanor stared at Jonathan's transforming body, her mind racing. She had read the old legends, the tales of vampirism passed down through the ages, the myth of creatures that fed on the life force of others. But this was no myth. It was real, and the infection was spreading through Jonathan faster than she had ever imagined possible. "He's turning into one of them," Eleanor muttered, almost to herself. "The bite. It's transforming him." Jonathan screamed, his voice raw, as his body arched unnaturally, bones snapping and realigning beneath his skin. His fingers elongated, nails sharpening into claws, and his eyes, once so familiar, so human, were now a predatory red, glowing in the dim light of the blood-colored sky. Mira backed away in horror, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We can't stop it. He's becoming one of those things." Jonathan's breathing had turned ragged, a low growl building deep in his chest. The transformation was nearly complete, his body contorting into something inhuman, monstrous. He looked up at Eleanor, his crimson eyes locking onto hers. For a brief moment, the man she had known was still there, his gaze pleading. "Kill me," he rasped, his voice barely human. "Before I lose myself." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. She reached for the sidearm holstered at her waist, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal grip. Could she really do this? Could she end the life of a man she had known for so long? A man who had trusted her, followed her into the abyss of space? Jonathan's body convulsed again, a guttural snarl ripping from his throat as the last vestiges of humanity slipped away. His eyes, now fully predatory, glinted with hunger, a hunger that could only be sated by blood. "Do it," Mira urged, her voice shaking. "You have to, Eleanor. He's not Jonathan anymore." With a deep, shuddering breath, Eleanor raised the gun, aiming it directly at Jonathan's head. His lips curled back in a snarl, his claws digging into the dirt beneath him as he prepared to lunge. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the trigger. She could still see traces of the man he once was, his face contorted in pain, his eyes momentarily flickering with something almost human. But it was too late. Jonathan leaped toward her, his claws outstretched, moving with terrifying speed. Reflexively, Eleanor pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the barren landscape, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. Jonathan collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Mira stood frozen, her face drained of all color. What? What are we going to do? The infection, it's spreading. I've seen these creatures. They don't stop. If we don't get off this planet... Eleanor shook her head, her mind racing. We can't leave. Not yet. Her voice was flat, almost emotionless, but inside, her thoughts were in turmoil. The creatures below were more than just ancient predators. They were the original inhabitants of this universe, beings older than humanity, older than Earth itself. They were cosmic scavengers, parasites that had fed on life for eons, draining planets and stars of their energy, moving from one celestial body to the next in an endless cycle of death and consumption. As Eleanor stood over Jonathan's body, a horrifying thought began to take root in her mind. What if this was inevitable? What if humanity itself was nothing more than a stop along the way, another source of sustenance for these creatures that had existed long before the stars had even formed? She looked at Mira, who was trembling, clutching her side as if something inside her had begun to tear apart. Mira had been scratched during the struggle. It was only a matter of time before she, too, succumbed to the infection. Mira's eyes locked onto Eleanor's, filled with desperate fear. I don't want to turn into one of them. Please, you have to. You have to stop it. Eleanor hesitated, gripping the gun tightly in her hand. She couldn't bring herself to kill another member of her crew. Not yet. But the infection was spreading faster than she could have anticipated. There was no cure, no escape. And as the blood-red sky darkened further, Eleanor realized with growing horror that the curse was not limited to those bitten by the creatures. She could feel it now, deep in her bones, crawling beneath her skin. The hunger, the insatiable thirst for something she couldn't name. It was inside her, too. Eleanor Graves stood at the edge of the planet's ancient city, staring out into the blood-red horizon. The ship lay in ruins behind her, smoke rising from its shattered hull, its systems fried beyond repair. The Acheron would never fly again, and there was no escape from the desolation that had become LV-616. The crimson sky stretched endlessly above her, a swirling vortex of clouds that seemed to pulsate with the same rhythmic beat she had felt in her bones ever since they first landed. The once silent world now thrummed with an alien energy, a presence she could no longer deny. It was as if the planet itself had awakened, feeding off the deaths, the suffering, the fear. She was alone now. Jonathan, Mira, Liam, and Edda were all gone, taken by the curse, consumed by the ancient hunger that lurked beneath the surface of this forsaken world. But their fate had been sealed the moment they touched down. Eleanor realized that now. It had always been waiting for them. The thirst stirred within her, a gnawing, insidious need that had begun as a faint whisper, but now roared in her veins like fire. Her body trembled as she fought to resist it, her fingers tightening into fists, nails biting into her palms. It was getting harder to think, harder to focus. Every breath she took felt wrong. Every inhale burned with the unrelenting desire for something more, something vital. She had watched Jonathan fall to it, seen the light drain from Mira's eyes as her body turned gray and shriveled. Eleanor knew she was no different. The infection had been inside her from the moment she touched the obelisk, and now it had spread. There was no denying it. She could feel the creatures, those ancient vampiric beings, moving in the darkness, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. They no longer hid from her. She was one of them now, part of their endless cycle. Their hunger was her hunger. Her body was betraying her. Her heartbeat had slowed, her skin had grown cold, and the sun, what little light remained in the dying sky, no longer warmed her. The thirst consumed everything else. Every thought, every memory, every trace of her humanity. Soon it would take her completely. Eleanor stumbled forward, her legs heavy, her breath labored. The ancient ruins loomed around her, massive and foreboding, their alien architecture twisting in ways that defied comprehension. The symbols on the walls pulsed softly, as though the stones themselves breathed in time with her shallow, ragged breaths. She reached the center of the city, the place where it had all started. The obelisk stood before her, towering and silent, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. The alien symbols carved into its black stone seemed to shift and writhe, as if they were alive, speaking to her in a language she could almost understand. It was here, at this very spot, that she had made contact with the beings that had lived here before. Beings not of flesh and bone, but of darkness and hunger. They were as old as the universe itself, cosmic predators that had existed long before humanity ever walked the earth. They had been imprisoned in this forgotten corner of the galaxy, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake them. And she had been that fool. She had thought she was chasing a signal, some anomaly that could unlock the secrets of the cosmos. Instead, she had answered their call. Their prison had been broken, and now they would feed again. Not just on her or the crew, but on everything. Every living thing, every star, every world. The hunger was endless. It could never be sated. A cold wind swept across the city, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, voices that echoed through her mind, growing louder with each passing second. They were calling to her, welcoming her into their fold. Her legs buckled and she fell to her knees before the obelisk, her body shivering as the hunger pulsed through her veins like molten fire. She could feel them inside her head now. The vampires, the true rulers of this dying universe. They were not like the vampires of legend, creatures of blood and fangs. No, they were something far worse. They fed on the very essence of life, draining the energy from worlds, leaving behind only cold, empty husks. They had no beginning, no end. They were eternal. And now she was one of them. Tears stung her eyes as she realized what she had become. There was no going back. She could never return to the person she had been before. Dr. Eleanor Graves, scientist, explorer, human. She was a vessel now, a host for something far older, far darker. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached out and placed her hand against the surface of the obelisk once more. The cold stone seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips as though it recognized her. The whispers in her mind grew louder, and for the first time she could understand them clearly. Feed, consume, become. The hunger roared inside her, and she knew she couldn't fight it any longer. Her body was no longer her own, it was theirs. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw Jonathan, Mira, and the others standing in the distance, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies desiccated and hollow. They were calling to her too, their voices blending with the chorus in her mind. She was part of the cycle now, just as they were. With a final shuddering breath, Eleanor let go of the last vestiges of her humanity. The thirst overtook her completely, consuming her thoughts, her will, her soul. The hunger would never end. It would drive her, as it had driven the others, to feed, to spread, to devour all that remained in the cold, dark reaches of space. And as the last light in the sky faded, she felt it, an insatiable urge, a need that could never be satisfied. Her transformation was complete. The vampires had awoken, and the hunger would spread. Eleanor stood, her eyes glowing with the same crimson light as the creatures that now surrounded her. She turned her gaze to the heavens, to the distant stars that flickered like dying embers. The signal had been sent, and soon more would come. The eternal hunger had only just begun, and in the far reaches of space, somewhere, a distant ship would hear her call.